smell what the rock is cooking.
Welcome back to Monster Mender! In this series, I take a monster from the mainline Monster Hunter games, give it a brief overview, then approach redesigning it in 3 different ways. The first design will be pretty faithful to the original, with relatively minor changes to either make it more visually interesting or to lean into its concept more. Then, I'll take the idea behind the monster and make a completely new design based on that, the monster I might make if I were given the prompt I assume the designers got. Besides the visuals of the monster, changes to movesets, lore, and behavior are on the table. Finally, I'll create a third illustration, even further separated from the monster I started with. It'll be boiled down to just a few keywords, and I'll give myself freedom to do whatever I want with the rest of the design. Same things can be changed in this version as in the second design, but more extreme modifications are also allowed, up to and including the monster's class. The monster's role in the game will still be taken into consideration in each approach, which I think is an important part of their design rationale, both mechanically and visually. It also prevents me from making monsters I don't like into punching bags, and cranking up my favorites into apocalyptic elder-level threats.
In this episode, we'll be bearing down on the buried boulder baby, Basarios. Basarios is pretty unique in that it is given its own name, despite being the juvenile version of another monster, Gravios. That said, it definitely has an identity of its own, even though it is of course similar to its adult form. Basarios may or may not be Monster Hunter's take on the fantasy trope of a golem or earth elemental, pretending to be a pile of rocks until disturbed, where it can then use its weight to push around its foes, while being made of rocks makes it pretty difficult to actually damage. In older iterations, the focus of Basarios' fight was to chip away the rocky exterior to make broken areas much better hit zones. In the Rise version, poor control over its ability to vent heat causes parts of its body to soften when it uses fire attacks, its head when it attempts its heat laser, or its torso when blasting heat out of the vents on its underside. This debatably defeats the entire point of the monster, although I think it actually does pull this mechanic off in a more engaging way than most other monsters whose shells have a heat mechanic, so in my opinion, both are valid choices. The design as a whole very effectively communicates what Basarios is about. It looks appropriately slow and heavy, and with shells several feet thick on its back, you're not surprised when your weapons just bounce off of it. To lean into the monster being a juvenile, the proportions of Basarios are somewhat different than they are in Gravios. Most notably, its tail and midsection are quite stumpy, and its round belly is emphasized by the same shape language being mirrored in the thick shelling on its back. All of these choices come together to form a kind of awkward, almost pudgy-looking monster that manages to maintain an intimidation factor by merit of its stony appearance and sheer bulk. One of the design features that isn't shared by Gravios at all is Basarios' unique and striking head. The face plating always reminded me of a targeting system or an X-shaped ballista. It's a nice design detail that helps keep it from just being a smaller Gravios with a rock backpack. What Basarios deliberately doesn't make obvious are its secret weapons. From its belly, it can vent not only fire, but poison and sleeping gases as well, byproducts of the process of digesting its diet of rocks, then co-opted into an extra defense mechanism. If you look really closely, you can see some of the pipes the gas comes out of on its legs and hips. Other attacks include some of the standard wyvern fare, a bite, a tail whip, and a hip check, supplemented by my most and least favorite moves in the wyvern's kit. The former uses its size and mass to its advantage, simply rolling at you to squish you flat, while the latter involves diving into the ground and swimming at you for some reason. It is also capable of firing molten stones from its gullet in the form of a magma ball, which can also come in triplicates, as well as performing the famous heat beam. A nice extra detail in this monster is that the heat beam can fail. I interpret this as Basarios' stomach being too small to hold enough magma to consistently use the attack, or its flame sac being undeveloped, so it can't produce enough heat to produce the beam. Either way, it sells the fact that this is a monster that is inexperienced. Guillermo del Toro's philosophy for monster design states that a monster should tell you as much as it can about itself with just its design. Basarios manages to strike a great balance in that, by making its main idea obvious to the player, while keeping hints to its secrets that very few people would ever pick up on the first time seeing it. Basarios is one of those monsters that knew what it wanted to be, and it did that, with very little in the way of extra bells and whistles. It simply wants to be a rock monster that eats rocks, and it does that very well. When thinking of things to change, there was only one thing that I really wanted to see different, and that was the head. I mentioned earlier that I think the head is very well designed and evocative of weaponry, and that is all true. But I feel that a feature like this would be more at home on the adult version of the species. It looks to me like a display structure that adults might use to judge each other's fitness, and their more refined laser attack makes it feel, to me, like the look of sighting instruments on their head is more suited to them. I also feel that giving Basarios Gravios' snorkel nose helps it look a little more childish. I made some minor changes besides this. I gave Basarios a blunted club-like tip to its tail to hint at the giant bulb it will grow as a Gravios. I also changed the shape of its wing claws slightly to be more robust and worn, so they look more useful for digging. But not swimming in the sand. That move is goofy, and my ideal Basarios doesn't have it anymore. Speaking of changes to the fight, I would like to see the armor heating mechanic expanded upon. Right now, Basarios spends the entire fight with one part or another softened, and I would rather it were something that I had to build up over the course of a few attacks, as having to chip the armor off really isn't that bad. Having both is the perfect compromise in my book, and it makes it even more of a stepping stone for Gravios. The other more significant change I made was to add stratification to the shell on its back. I am not sure if this has ever been confirmed or denied anywhere, but I like to believe that when Basarios eat minerals, impurities and excess material are secreted by what will become extra heat vents lining its back when it reaches maturity. This results in layers of rock building up on the top of Basarios, both adding to its defense and camouflage. Additionally, when going an extended period without food, it can reabsorb some of these to keep itself going for a while, like a camel's hump, though at the risk of ruining the foundation these boulders rest on, possibly leading them to crack and fall apart. You can see the history of where an individual Basarios has been by observing the layers of different material covering its back, and the guild can sometimes use them as indicators for areas that are rich in precious minerals. At the end of the day, I don't know if I would like to see the official Basarios have these layers on their shells, although it is a concept I am happy to have spent some time exploring. Well, starting off, you can see I forgot to film the sketching process and that the canvas flashes black a couple times. I can only offer my humblest of whoopsie daisies. As for the design, it may be a bit similar to normal Basarios, not expanding terribly much on the idea visually, and that is partly because I feel that Capcom really nailed it the first time, but also because this Basarios is laying the groundwork for some ideas I have for its Gravios counterpart, which I won't give away yet. In the interest of trying something new, I went for a more rounded, smooth look on this version. If the first version excreted undigested minerals from its back, I figured I should just take the other approach on this one, making them nothing more than layers upon layers of carapace all grown on top of each other to form a thick shell, which is probably what the original is going for. To emphasize the weight of this creature, I dropped it onto all fours, into the pseudo-wyvern stance of Tigrex and the gang. This version is more focused on physical attacks, rather than the original's bag of tricks, so I thought that stance would allow for more stomping and heaving its weight around in a more controlled, dangerous way. You may also have noticed the extra holes in its forehead that are emitting colorful smoke. I felt that the statuses were an excellent inclusion on Basarios both for gameplay and lore reasons. It makes sense for a slow wyvern that cannot run away from anything to have several anti-predator mechanisms to ensure it a safe ride to maturity. This Basarios vents its gases from the blowhole in its head, acting like a spray it can use to keep distance. It blows out the poison or sleep gas at random, like usual, in a line in front of it. Additionally, while enraged, its body temperature rises enough for its underdeveloped flame sac to start working, allowing it to breathe a spark and ignite the gas, catching anybody either asleep or poisoned within on fire. As an extra bit of flavor, while enraged, it will spew out purple and blue smoke from its blowholes as well as the usual steam from its mouth. It was difficult finding another way to make a stone-based flying wyvern, but I am pretty happy with this result. And, with the new format of the researcher's notes, I was able to spend some time developing some lore for it, which I also really enjoyed. Now for the final version of Basarios, and this marks the first time I am changing a monster's class. I feel like I had exhausted all my interesting ideas for making stone flying wyvern, So I looked at what other classes would have fit. Originally, I was going to make this a crab with a bagworm-like tendency to build a shell out of stones it finds, though after a quick consult with a friend, they were more interested in this concept. As you may have figured out from the references, this design is inspired by Pachycephalosaurus, and as an extension, partially by Cranidos, a pure rock-type Pokemon based on the dinosaur. As you may have also noticed, Brachydios' body plan is another source of inspiration here. I thought it would be interesting to contrast Brachydios' explosive boxing with a monster based on punch mitts. It uses its giant arms to bust rocks into more edible smithereens, which are equally effective for shattering hunters. When breaking up rocks, shards get stuck in the ridges of Basarios' pounders, which causes them to fire out like shrapnel when smashing them into the ground once or twice right after it eats. The pounders still retain a little bit of the crab plan. 2 fingers are fused together to form a solid block of carapace, but its thumb is free to pinch like a crab claw. This thumb talon is good for doing more delicate work, breaking up fragile crystals without turning them into powder, which is difficult to eat when you can't hold a spoon. Aside from using its pounders to, well, pound things, they are good for guarding. Occasionally, the wyvern will hunker down, covering all its weak points, like Daimyo Hermitar does, which can similarly be followed up with a counter, smashing its thick skull into the ground like a hammer. Even more so than the second approach, this design is based around physical attacks. On top of plenty of hefty smashes with its pounders, it also has access to head-first charges, as well as sideways tackles that try to catch a hunter between its carapace and the ground. As a last resort, it can vomit its stomach contents of gravel at enemies, along with the highly corrosive gastric acid needed to digest rock, inflicting defense down. I'm honestly not sure if the Brute Wyvern or Carapaceon takes would have been more interesting, but I do like the monster I ended up with. If you'd like to talk about what the crab monster could have been like, feel free to discuss in the comments, or better yet, join the Discord. There we go. One last Monster Mender before the school year starts in earnest. I'm not sure if I will be able to make any more high-effort content like this during the school year, but I will try to be active on the Discord, which you can join with the link in the description. If you want to join, you can come hang out with us and talk Monster Hunter. Also, you can thank Mark Whitfield 4396 for the idea of presenting the finished designs in this researcher's notes format. I think that was a really good idea. Brings me back to my ARC days. Well, anyway, go ahead and let me know any feedback you have for me in the comments. It's always appreciated. Also, there will be a pinned comment where you can cast your vote for the next monster I cover in the series, and if one in particular gets a lot of votes, I bump it up in the queue. While you're at it, drill that like, split that subscribe, and blind all the other buttons the algorithm demands. Happy hunting!